everyone. Delighted to have you with us for this launch of the Parents Aren't All Right, Elliot Haspel's newsletter, coming soon from all of us at Capita. It's so nice to have you with us, and so nice to have this wonderful and distinguished panel that Elliot is going to be chatting with over the next hour. I'm Joe Waters. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Capita. Capita is an ideas lab working at the intersection of research, policy, social innovation, design, and the arts to build a future in which all children and families flourish. And of course, the health, the well-being, the flourishing even of our parents is of critical concern to the well-being of our children, their children, our children. And so we cannot neglect the needs of our children and our parents, their parents, as we seek to design a future in which all of us flourish. So I'm delighted that Elliot has decided to partner with us to bring this newsletter, and delighted by today's panel discussion. I hope you all enjoy it. I'll turn it over now to Elliot.
Thanks so much, Joe, and thanks to all of you for joining us, and thank you to the panel who will be introducing a little bit more in just a few minutes. I'm just going to give a sort of a quick overview of sort of what's this newsletter all about, why am I doing this, and then really I want to spend the bulk of this hour talking to these amazing thinkers that we've assembled who do a lot of work thinking, writing, researching, living out these questions of what does it look like to have a nation where all families can flourish and all children can flourish. So what I wanted to start the newsletter, and why I really want to start this project, is thinking about, we know that parents are struggling right now, and particularly mothers. I obviously come at this from the lived experience of being a white man. I'm a parent, I do have 2 daughters, but certainly not the one who's experiencing the burden as hard as moms are, and particularly moms of color. But we do know that parents are struggling across the board in America, and they were struggling far before COVID ever hit. But now we're in this situation of what the New York Times in their poignant feature called the primal scream, where it has just gotten beyond the pale in terms of how bad it's gotten. We're in a time now where families are increasingly squeezed by high costs of living amidst low wage growth, brutal student loan balances, and credit card and medical debt. The line between work and home is now just some unrecognizable new. It used to be, in many ways, our obligations to help our aging baby boomer parents are rising. The millennials are increasingly what's known as a sandwich generation, where we're sort of sandwiched between needing to care for our own young children and needing to care for aging parents. And at the same time, social connections with peers are fraying. And actually the gap even between couples being able to have the number of children that they want and the children they're actually having is widening, which ultimately has many impacts on the well-being of the families themselves, and has societal and at some level existential sort of threats to America and to the world itself, because having sort of a society of stressed out parents with not a lot of kids running around is pretty much exactly what you don't want when you're facing down the specter of things like climate change and other geopolitical crises that we need to be able to tackle. And then, as if all that wasn't enough, we're also in this era of what sociologists will talk about this, I'm sure, call concerted cultivation or intensive parenting. Claire King Miller of the New York Times calls it the relentlessness of modern parenting. But basically, it's this idea that we have these enormous expectations that we sort of receive from society around us to make sure that our children are perfectly prepared to succeed for this uncertain, anxious world that we're heading towards. And research, and so I think what I want to do with this newsletter is 2 things. One is I don't want to just be super depressing all the time. I think we need to be able to say, okay, here's where we're at. But I also think we need to talk about solutions. And that's one thing that I think is exciting. So Joe actually in Capita has been leading myself and a group of other early childhood stakeholders on a sort of a book seminar. It's kind of a little bit like grad school. This book called The Good Ancestor, which is a wonderful book that you should check out by a philosopher. And it basically talks a lot about how we need transcendent goals. We need to be able to think ahead to an imaginable future that is far more equitable, that works far better than the current one does, and then be able to basically look backwards and backwards plan our way to get from here to there. You can kind of think about the future as either sort of scenarios in history that's unfolding, and then we have to be able to manage sort of to adjust and deal with what kind of life throws our way. Or we can think about, and he talks about in this book, kind of drawing history towards us, and basically being able to shape the future that we want by being able to, that starts by saying, what is that future? What are the values, sort of new set of family values that underlie, a society in which every family is able to access the childcare that they want and need for their families to flourish, that are able to access the play structures and the physical environment that they need for themselves and their children to flourish, that have the social connections among peers and among other parents and among up and down the generations that they need to flourish. How they have secure attachments, that they aren't stressed out all the time, that we aren't constantly in this state of precariousness where we feel like we're walking along the cliff's edge. Like these are deep questions that oftentimes I think the contemporary debates over any given issue of the day can overwhelm. And so the newsletter, which is going to be twice a month, I'm not trying to overwhelm anyone's inboxes. There are a lot of amazing newsletters out there already, and Helen's being among them. And I think what I'm trying to do is ask these bigger questions. Where should we be going? How do we get there? What are the fundamental structures and values and philosophies we're going to need to engage with to create America that works for all parents? So, I think we've got, I'll be sending a lot of words into your inbox if you sign up for that, which you can do, on Capita's website. I'm sure we'll drop the link into the chat if you haven't already done that. But one of the things that's great is I get to kind of stand on the shoulders of giants on this. I am far from thinking about this, and more importantly, I think there are perspectives that have really informed my own. And so I'm really excited to have this conversation with this panel about both where are we, and because we have to acknowledge and face sort of where we are at the moment, and then what would it look like to start moving towards an America that works for families. So really, really excited to have this conversation. And without any further ado, and do quick intros, you can see the sort of broader bios on the event page. But thrilled to introduce Diana Lamanji. She's a bilingual freelance nonprofit professional, podcaster and activist, and the creator and host of Parenting and Politics, which is a podcast that looks at parenting through a political lens. Anne Helen Peterson, a journalist, former academic, and author, most recently of the excellent book Can't Even: How Millennials Became the Burnout Generation. And she's currently on work for another book about the future of work. Dr. Allison Pugh, the professor of sociology and the chair of the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality at the University of Virginia, my alma mater, wahoo wah. And Dr. Pugh has also written several books, including one that's really poignant called The Tumbleweed Society, all about sort of insecurity in our connection with one another. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Casey Stockstill is a sociology professor and mom of two at the University of Denver, University of Colorado at Denver, sorry. No, University of Denver? There, all right, thank you. And your research is about how kids and teachers experience segregated preschools in the United States. So thrilled to have this distinguished panel, and I'm gonna, without any further intro, launch right in. So the first question, Dr. Pugh, I'm going to give to you. So your research has covered many topics, but including relevant for this conversation, how parenting has evolved in the past decade or so, and the general insecurity and precarity, again, the sort of precariousness that today's parents face. So can you ground us in an overview about the main sort of forces that are animating parents' lives today?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Elliot. I just wanted to say you've gathered together a bunch of writers that I read, and I'm really looking forward to this panel. So, and I'm also particularly excited about your newsletter, actually. Part of what I hope is launched with this conversation and with the pockets of people who care about care across the nation is a care movement. And I think I see things like newsletters that inform and educate and start a conversation about these issues as kind of formative for those kind of movements. You asked, what are the main forces that animate the lives of today's parents? First, I would just say this is a very worrisome time to be a parent, and it is also a worrisome place to be a parent. But I would say that was also true even before the pandemic. The pandemic just exposes the weak care infrastructure that we have. But even before this, you could have had this panel before, and I would be saying some of the same things. Even before the pandemic, American parents felt individually responsible for what we might call social failures. The failure to make it possible to have children and work at the same time, and the failure to protect families against the inevitable challenges of caring for the sick and the elderly, challenges that are more likely to be crises here than in other countries. And the stress that individual parents feel, and we hear that stress, is actually generated, I would argue, in part by a system that produces these as problems that American parents have to individually solve. There's two main forces I would point out to you, and your introduction talked about them already to some degree, and that the first one is insecurity. You can't talk about parenting without talking about work. Parents want steady work. They want enough money to provide for the basics. They want to plan for long-term needs. They want to save for emergencies. And so insecurity, by which I mean economic insecurity and job insecurity, essentially not making enough, and when you lose your job periodically, or what are called like kind of income shocks. Both of those things are I'm lumping together under something we might call insecurity or even instability. And that's the first issue that shapes how hard it is to parent in the United States. So there's a lot of research that finds that, patterns of instability have increased over time, over the past decade and for decades prior to that, especially for low-income families and for families of color. Although middle-income families experience it too, as do households even at the top 1%. It's not only at the bottom, but it's just concentrated there. And instability matters, we know, for how children do. We know there are correlations between kind of repeated income shocks and reduced educational engagement, and between instability and food insecurity, and between instability and reduced educational achievement in adulthood, especially for children in low-income families. So instability really matters. But something else also shapes what parenting is like here, and that is inequality. And inequality, the United States, we've heard this. I don't know, maybe you all have not heard it as much as I have, but it was a drumbeat for a long time, for the last decade, about how the US is much more unequal than other advanced industrialized democracies. It's inching closer to levels of inequality we see in India. Wealth gap has more than doubled in the last 40 years, that kind of thing, right? What's less well known is how this affects parenting. And there have been some beautiful studies that kind of point out the effects of inequality on parenting. I'll give you just one. One was a study that looked at state level variations in income inequality. And they found that when inequality is higher, gaps in parental financial investments between rich families and other families is significantly and substantially wider. What that means is when there's inequality around you, rich families double down and they invest even more in their kids than they already are doing. Inequality, they've also found on cross-cultural, country-wide, across countries. They've found that it also affects parenting. So in one cross-national study, there was correlations between low inequality and generous redistributive policies and parenting styles. So societies with kind of relative equality, with robust safety nets, parents are more relaxed, and children are allowed more time for self-discovery and play. Whereas in highly unequal societies, parenting is intense and it's achievement-oriented. It makes sense. It makes intuitive sense. You're kind of living in a rat race. You feel the high stakes of your parenting. But I want to just let us think back to the 1950s, which is, a problematic decade for all sorts of reasons. But here's what I want to call upon in the 1950s. The psychoanalyst D.W. Winnicott came up with this term, the good enough mother. That's the only thing I want to come back from the 50s, the good enough mother. And today that might sound like a slight or kind of a backhanded compliment, but he meant it as a statement of what children need to thrive, which is a mother that provides, or we'll call it a primary caregiver in today's language, opening it up to dads, a mother or a father who provide for most of what their children need, but don't strive for an unattainable perfection. And what does it mean that that's no longer an acceptable standard today? Why do we expect parents to be perfect? Well, I'm here to tell you that in part, the thing you can't necessarily see, the social inequality behind you, is part of what's part of the engine that's driving that intensification of parenting. I have a lot more to say, the weakness of the care infrastructure, but I know you have other experts who can speak to that.
Well, thank you. Makes me want to go back to my UVA days and take a course from you, and if we could do it again. No, thank you. And actually, that's really illuminating. And you was thinking as you were talking about the sort of sense of rich parents doubling down or kind of clenching a little bit about Caitlin Flanagan's cover article in The Atlantic this month about private schools, and how even rich parents are like starting to like flip out basically in new ways, even over the past decade or two, about being able to get their children to a secure place, which doesn't bode super well for the rest of us. So, Diana, in turn to you now. You live, talk about, write about, parenting, policy, politics, like on the daily. So given what you just heard from Allison, like how do you see that insecurity, the inequality playing out for you, the parents and how, have they informed the rise of sort of parent advocacy and the parent voice, which I do feel like is one positive thing that's happened over the past, decade or so, is it does feel like there's been more parent voice in the conversation.
So thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. So as Allison was speaking, I was thinking back to my childhood. My parents are immigrants who came to this country and met here and got married here, and low income. But my father was in a union, and now that I'm an adult, I realize what a difference that made in my access to healthcare, right? And the fact that he had paid vacation time or paid sick time. I didn't realize till I was an adult that not everyone grows up like that, right? So there's certainly, safety nets that some people have that some people aren't. And I think that one of the problems is that now we see that, a lot of people don't have access to unions. A lot of people don't have access to healthcare. A lot of people, and that certainly impacts mostly low income and people of color. And also what you were mentioning about, when you're low income or maybe you just, my father never went to college. It was always drilled down. Your job is to get an education. Your job is to go to school. Your job is to go to college. Your job is to, get a master's, whatever the next level is. That was expected and ingrained in us. And, for extras, I think there wasn't a lot of opportunity because everything was so expensive. So that's kind of a little bit of what came up as you were speaking. And then for the advocacy, I think that right now what I'm seeing around me is kind of like a backlash, like I feel like when my son is 10, and I feel like when I was a parent, I wanted to like do the prep for the G&T and do all these things and, get all the opportunities. And now maybe it's a second child syndrome, but I'm also seeing that a lot of parents are like, these systems are unequal and they perpetuate the inequity in our communities. So a lot of parents, I feel like, are taking a more critical look. This is what I'm seeing in my community. To the point where a lot of parents are saying, no, this needs to be reformed because why is it that, most of these I'm using GNT as an example. I'm in New York City. So if you are familiar with that, you know what I'm talking about. A lot of people are feeling we have to reform these so that there is more equity and that there's more opportunity for people who it's not that they're not, gifted and talented, whatever that means, but why are we not looking at creating all schools where there are these opportunities for more children, as opposed to this program where, what is it, 3%, 4% of people that apply get in. I mean, it's kind of insane. And also, how do you prep a 3.5, 4-year-old for these? I mean, it's absolutely insane, just on a social emotional level. So I think that's what I'm seeing right now, but I'm also seeing that parents are kind of pushing back to this individualistic, right? And it's like, we need to, if COVID has showed us anything, is that we need to come together, and no man is an island. So we have to kind of shift that and see what is better for the collective. So I think that's what I'm seeing in the parents that are doing advocacy work. I don't know if I totally answered your question, because I feel like I might have gone on a tangent.
No, I think that's right, and it is helpful. I mean, that is one way where you're starting to see parents respond to the sort of system that is absolutely not working and is hyper competitive, right? As you're starting to see some bucking back and say, actually, no, like, right, it's not cool that we have to shell out $10,000 a year for childcare. It's not okay that we need to be fighting each other for these couple of slots. And some parents are responding by doubling down, but I do think you're right. Some parents are responding by starting to advocate and realize that parent power is a thing. If we can, actually get organized and sort of forge those bonds of solidarity. So thank you for that. And then, Dr. Stockstill, this has come up a few times already, but it's clear that we can't separate out conversations about parenting in America from conversations about race in America. And your research looks particularly at the intersection of race and early childhood when it comes to preschool, speaking of the 3 and 4-year-olds. So how do you see racial inequities playing out in the modern day sort of parenting space?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for having me on the panel. So yeah, Allison and you and Diana, everyone's kind of alluded to extra struggles that families of color are facing. And I think that's one aspect of the pressure that racism puts on parents. We see it in disproportionate poverty rates and in wealth gaps. So Black and Latinx families are 2.5 times more likely to be in poverty than white families. They also have significantly less family wealth to draw on. And so it's just kind of the economic basis, the legs you have to stand on, it's smaller for many Black, Latinx, and Indigenous families. And then in our communities, there's less literal wealth to draw on as well. The other thing that we're all seeing, that everyone's noticing but has always been there, is a struggle that parents of color have to raise our children, with dignity and with self-worth, even in a world that continues to have racial discrimination, hate crimes, police violence. And so this has always been going on, but we're just seeing more. I mean, we're seeing some things rise, like anti-Asian hate crimes, for example. We're also having a reckoning where other people and other parents, white parents, are noticing discrimination, hate crimes, broader racism, police brutality, all these things that have been known to parents of color for decades. And so I see this racial reckoning happening for many white parents. And I think, for speaking, kind of putting my mom hat on rather than my sociologist hat, in the circles that I'm in, there's kind of some, cynicism from parents of color to say, like, oh, thanks for showing up. Like, thanks for realizing that racism persists and it's something that we're dealing with. So I do see white parents, sort of racial reckoning as an ultimately positive thing. I think it's a piece of, the puzzle of dismantling racism. But I think we have a long way to go. And so in the early childhood space specifically, I think we're seeing an unwinding of this colorblind experiment. So I was raised in the 90s in like the heyday of colorblindness of, okay, we did civil rights reforms, we did some affirmative action policies in places of employment and in universities, like people have a fair shot now. And so the next step, the experiment went, the next step is to stop talking so much about race, pull out that one MLK quote, Martin Luther King Jr. quote, don't talk about skin color differences, see everyone as the same, and that will be the end of racism. And that is the era in which I was raised. That I think was an ethos of a lot of parents. And I think that what we're seeing now is that unwinding. And many parents, especially white parents who might have avoided talking about race or taught their kids don't see color, don't see difference, are realizing that that hasn't worked. when you take a color or pretend to, I would say, to take a colorblind perspective, then you can't see or talk about racial discrimination that we know, social scientists show us that discrimination persists in employment, housing, healthcare, just everywhere. So anyway, we're seeing that colorblindness roll back, and I think it's very slowly trickling into early childhood education, because I think many parents, I would include some parents of color, and early childhood educators want to make sort of a utopia for young kids. It's like, oh, it's hard to be an elementary schooler. There's all these academic pressures coming, but early childhood, you should be like warm at home playing with no existence or understanding of racism. And so anyway, I've been invited into more conversations with preschool teachers, with parents who are like, when should I talk to my kid about race? Like, when should I break it to them that racism exists? And the research on this topic shows us that kids already notice race. They have agency. They notice like who drives the buses in the city and who their teachers are. They have their own sense of these inequalities. And what I'm seeing is white parents, especially, being more open to talking to their very young kids about not just race, but racism and inequality. And the last thing I'll say is what I'm watching for and what I'm wary about as a parent, as a Black parent, is people who are new, white parents who are new to this issue and are like, okay, I want to do right by people of color. I want to be an anti-racist. So I'm reading books, I'm reading Robin DiAngelo, and I also want my kid to have diverse playmates. And so that concerns me. There's a sense of like, I'm going to now curate a childhood for my kid that looks diverse because that feels right to me. But sometimes it comes with this ethos of like, their kids will consume my kid, like their kids will benefit from my children as some sort of commodity. But children of color are full people, just like white children, right? And so there's a lot of complexities basically that we need to keep talking about as we have this racial reckoning in general, and as parents navigate that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And it's as a white parent of white middle class daughters, that's been an interesting thing to navigate. And even because I, as a child in the 90s too, I was also in that same kind of colorblind thing. And now taking my like 2 and 4 year old at the time to like Black Lives Matter protests, but also like not wanting to make that a fully integrated or fully sort of, I don't know, again, so do it in the correct way and approach it in the correct way is certainly, I know I don't always get it right, and it's certainly it's something that parents are having to reckon with, I think across all sorts of different lines of difference. So thank you for that. So for the first part, so to end this kind of one kind of round of questions of like where we are right now, I want to turn to you, Anne Helen, and because in addition to the forces that are buffeting parents specifically, and some of Dr. Pugh and other people's research has shown that parents tend to actually have it worse than most of the general public in a lot of ways. But there are broader changes happening in society, and they're showing up in different ways for millennials and other older generations. And you've written about what you call the hollowing out of the middle class, changes in how and where we work. It's like the ground is kind of shifting. So like, what do you think, what are the trends we need to be aware of as we talk about kind of the future for parents?
Yeah, I mean, I think I echo everyone here in saying that all of these things were happening before the pandemic, right? And I think that one of the things that the pandemic has done is given us some space to really like take the status quo, put it on a platter, turn it around and be like, oh, what if it doesn't have to be this way? And I think that extends to so many different parts of parenting and the infrastructure of care, like that has been broken for a very long time. And because it broke all at once for a lot of people, it finally forced, I think, many people whose lives are affected by it, either as primary caregivers or as extended caregivers or as actual members of the ECU workforce, to consider it for the first time. And I might be frozen. We'll see. Here we go. And I think that in general, people are looking around them as we are slowly emerging and questioning some of the decisions that they've made to this point, what decisions they want to make moving forward. The other day on Twitter, someone said, like, I think we're going to have a great reshuffling in terms of workplaces, like people who are making what is usually a more distributed quarter life or midlife crisis employment decision, because either the pandemic has highlighted just how unsustainable the situation that a family was operating under actually is, or because people were laid off or went on unemployment and have had that forced job switch that they can actually say, oh, I hated that job, whether that job is an hourly job where the schedule was only available 2 to 3 days ahead of time. And it was incredibly difficult to figure out care scenarios for that. And just also stressful in your life and not a job that you liked. If you have been on unemployment for the last few months, 6 months, almost a year, you right now have those people have the option, which is often very hard to come by, of saying, I want to choose what kind of job like. There are so many job openings right now. Can I have a little bit more in terms of options in finding a work scenario that is better for my lifestyle, better for my family, better for my body and the wear and tear on my life? So I think that's like optimistically a slightly good thing. But at the same time, I think back on what happened after the Great Recession, where all of these jobs that disappeared were eventually added back to the economy in the form of gig work, right? Unsupported work that doesn't have a safety net, work that wasn't unionized. And so how can we think in terms of our labor laws? How can we update our labor laws to actually accommodate to these styles of work? And I think part of that includes things like universal healthcare, if we can ever get there, but also creating an incredibly robust care infrastructure that means like that decouples understandings of like who can have supplements, who can find available care from the type of work that you do, or if you work at all. So that's a very broad look at everything. But someone told me the other day, it was an older dude whose kids are in middle school. And he was like, I think people are pretty fine with this scenario. Like people are excited, they're getting vaxxed, like everything's going to go back to normal. And I was just like, I think that like the amount of exhaustion that has accumulated in our lives, in our bodies, like we're at a really interesting inflection point. And I hope that it manifests in a will towards change and in a will towards it doesn't have to be this way anymore.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because I think that's right. Like this is just magnified so many of these existing inequities, and like the ground is so, it's split open so many fault lines. So yes, either we can just try to go back to things there and just sort of ignore the giant canyons that we have to hop over, or we can actually do something about it, which I think leads into the good sort of transition. Okay, so things are not going well right now. The parents are not all right. So I want to spend the last sort of half of this thinking about what it would look like if the parents were all right. And so I also encourage people who are listening, if you want to put questions or thoughts in the chat and the Q&A, you don't know how many you'll be able to get to, but at least we can, follow up with those. So then I'm going to turn back to you, and I asked, in prep for this, I sort of asked this question ahead of time, which was let's sort of do some future casting here. So it's 2031, it's 10 years from now. We all got to run the country for a decade, and it went great. Like we did such a good job. So what does the new or family-friendly America look like? What's in place? What are the values that are guiding us? Like paint us the picture of the blue sky world here.
I love that you asked me this question because I had so much fun imagining it. So I wrote 4 things down that I'm going to go by quickly. The first thing is, I really hope that in 10 years, there'll be a real cultural narrative shift about kind of moving away from the individual, pulling myself up from my bootstraps and, I can do this. And if you didn't do it, then that's because you suck, as opposed to there are structural things that are not allowing us to, get out of poverty and et cetera, right? So that's one thing. And I think that we're moving in that direction. I really think that by 2031, we'll be there. The second thing is talking about care. I want to see care from like prenatal to like the grave, right? I want, and with that goes this idea of like universal healthcare, right? Like prenatal, if you're in health and you don't have all these stressors, you can be pregnant and not and have a better pregnancy, and then et cetera, all that goes along with it. If you have universal health care, of course, you don't have to worry about the bills that are going to arrive and like put your family in bankruptcy or put you in debt, you know, that kind of thing. I would love to see fully funded schools, right? Why are we spending more money in prisons per inmate as opposed to schooling for our kids, right? And that includes early childhood. So when I said prenatal to grave, I really do mean it. And that includes, you know, things like after school, and that also I think includes thinking about how we work, right? Why are we still, now it's going to change with COVID, and Helen mentioned it, but why are we still functioning like a 9 to 5 when kids go to school from like 8 to 2, right? What, even if your school is open, that still is impossible for working parents, usually working moms who have to figure out what to do when your school is closed for, you know, all the holidays like Veterans Day that people don't get off, but kids do, right? The other thing is I would love for government to look like its citizens. That means in not only racially, because that's, I think, the first thing we think about, but also age. Also having an understanding of like what things cost, right? When I hear people fight back a $15 minimum wage, to me, that's horrifying, because if you do the math, $15 an hour, if you work 35, 40 hours is not a lot, right? It's not going to make you a millionaire. You're not going to go buy, you know, a Bentley. Like it's a little bit ridiculous. So I think we need people in government who actually understand what things cost and what it costs to raise a family, which is, I think, why we need more parents in office. And the last thing I'll say is I hope that with COVID, we're seeing that, you know, it can't be all about work, right? That it's not healthy mentally, physically, for people to be, for anyone, whether you're a parent or whether you're not a parent, it's not healthy for anyone to be working 80 hours a week, to not have vacation time. I think we may be the only industrialized country, in addition to, you know, not paid leave, no universal health care, there's no mandated vacation time. I mean, you need time to decompress so that you can do your job effectively, right? And have ideas, right? Sometimes you just need to sit on a couch and, I don't know, you have a eureka moment about fixing a problem. So I do think that we need to have kind of a more holistic kind of, it's not all about producing. You also have to have mind, body, wellness, you know, and that all goes along with the healthcare and this kind of reshifting the way we think about. So that was my very quick, this is what I want.
I love it. I want to live it. I want to go to there. It's I think a lot of what you speak to is kind of what I alluded to in my first comment, like this idea of Capita talks about like human flourishing. Like we don't just want to be like able to like endure and like get through one day and get through a week and get through. We actually want to be able to thrive towards, you know, some full sort of human experience, and, you know, whatever someone defines kind of like the good life as. Like we don't talk in that language anymore in this country, if we ever did in any equitable sense. And I think you're describing as a place where parents have the space to enjoy their children and to you know, not have to constantly be distracted thinking about, you know, what bills need to come and due, or, you know, like the fact that the school playground is crumbling, or any of those things. So I really like that vision. And on that, you know, Dr. Sachs, I wanted to sort of turn back to you, and if we kind of zoom in there to your area of research, which is again is sort of like how sort of parents experience early childhood and preschool, and think about like those early years, you know. So in this, you know, much more equitable world, like what needs to change to make sure everyone can access that vision? And, you know, what would you like to be researching? What would your like ideal sort of research project be? You know, if we've been able to move into this new, you know, this new world.
Oh, juicy questions. I love these questions. This was really hard. This was a hard assignment for me. I think a lot of sociologists are really pessimistic about social change because it's so slow. So I had to really put on my optimist hat that 10 years, if we did it, like if this panel ran the country, I do think we could do it. So what I envision is we've kept updated child tax credits in place. We've had an aggressive housing policy. And so there might still be some income, there is still income inequality, and there are still people who earn less, but people in the bottom 20% of earners have stability. They may not have a lot of money, but they never worry about buying diapers or food, and they have healthcare. Like, those stressors are not present, even if they're still not earning as much as they might need to flourish. So we've made a huge dent in poverty, and in doing that, we've disproportionately lifted Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous families up. And so those neighborhoods have more resources to draw on, those families have more resources to draw on. We're so smart, we understand that housing and healthcare are early childhood policy, right? And so we're not just doing like a parenting improvement program. Did you know you should read to your child, right? We're like, how is your housing and your employment? Do you have the things that you need to, like Diana said, to not be, you know, super stressed out and to be able to think on the couch sometimes. In terms of childcare, we value all parents as caregivers, truly. So we don't talk anymore as if poor families are somewhat deficient, and so we need to get those kids out of their lacking home environments and into a preschool that's going to be so much better, because those teachers know how to raise children more than parents do. This is, I think this is a discourse that we still have to an extent. And so we value all of children's caregivers. We think about family as kin and extended family, and not in such a nuclear or really just like mom-child dyad sort of thing. And so we have money and supports and an understanding that grandparents and aunts and neighbors might be deeply involved in raising children. And then thinking specifically of like preschool and early childhood centers, we've moved beyond access. Like, everybody has access, and we're now critiquing quality. And that's what I would like to be studying is, I mean, we're talking about quality of early childhood programs now, but our measures don't capture everything. And so we're not just talking about quality, we're talking about dignity and thriving. So not like, can kids access a program that's good enough with a teacher that went to college, but how does that child feel in their preschool? You know, is there racial identity? Is there family identity? Is that celebrated? Are we like involving their family and their kin and their neighborhood in their early education? So I could go on forever, but I'll stop now. And those are some of the things that I got excited about with this question.
Yeah, and I think that's great. It's I love the expansiveness of that vision, and you know, the way that it does sort of honor so many different American traditions and really builds on them into this new equitable, you know, world that we should be heading towards. So thank you for that. You know, and Helen, I think a lot of what, you know, both Ben and Casey, Dr. Stockdale to some extent are describing, you know, there are some policy things in there. We've all talked about that: healthcare, childcare funding, right? There are also these cultural pieces that underlie it. And, you know, for example, something I was struck with in reading, you know, Can't Even, is you talk about like millennials have this tendency to like want to always monetize our hobbies. Like, there's something in the water where then I feel this all the time too. You know, I something in a newsletter in my spare time. You know, it's this sense of like, you know, we have certain cultural expectations, I think, we sort of inhale like the air quality. And I have this deep sense that our culture is going to need to shift along with our policy. And I'm curious if you could sort of just reflect on, you know, what's the cultural shifts that we need to be moving towards over the next decade if we're going to make some of these changes.
I mean, there's been really interesting research looking at the fact that like the spikes in popularity in productivity books and in productivity apps come after moments of economic, like widespread societal economic precarity. And so for people who are working in jobs where it's more difficult to evidence your productivity simply by being there, right? Like that you have to somehow show that you are working by like emailing all the time or getting things done or whatever. There is this need to show your value through the checking, you know, things off a list, working at all times, but also essentially colonizing the rest of your time as a space that could be monetized. And that could be actually doing gig work, like driving for Uber, teach, like, you know, the classic example of the high school teacher who doesn't make enough to support their family and drives Uber on the weekends, but also turning like the cakes that you used to bake as part of your leisure, or like the cross stitch that you used to do, turning that into something that can be monetizing, and thus sucking all of the leisure component out of it and turning your entire 24-hour cycle into something that can and should be monetized. And that collides like straight on with the good old-fashioned Protestant work ethic of like your desire to be working all the time is somehow a moral good, right? That like the more you want to work in any capacity, the more that you make whatever you are doing into something that is like work, and that includes parenting, the better person you are, right? Like you are evidencing your electness on some capacity, that you are a good American. And all of that is, of course, an ideological construct, right? And there are so many ways to resist it. And I think that many millennials in particular who came of age in their 20s during a particular time of precarity are now facing this reality of like, what else is left of myself if not my ability to work? And I've been thinking a lot recently about this great Anna North column from a couple weeks back in Vox that is ostensibly about the difficulty with aligning things like our childcare schedules with our work schedules. And she's like, the problem, obviously is how childcare is organized in our society, but also the problem is work, right? The problem is how much we expect people to work in order to make enough money to cover their living expenses. And that includes like whatever echelon someone is aspiring to class-wise or is trying to cling to class-wise. So I think that, echoing some of the things that we talked about before, I think Diana mentioned this specifically, like, I do think there is some resistance right now. Like, I think people are starting to push back and say, like, what if we don't have to work all the time? What if childcare doesn't have to be this way? What if we don't have to think this way about always trying to turn our middle-class children into like mini college resumes in order to give them some sort of purchase on their future? So that's my vague moment of hopefulness.
I think that's great. Yes, I mean Derek Thompson calls it workism. I've heard it. I think Bridget Schultz called it the age of overwhelm. Like there have been people trying to like circle this concept of so like our over focus on work. One thing I just want to say there is, I'm actually encouraged that is one place we may actually be able to cross partisan divides, because there is a significant number of people, and I always say I self-identify myself as a pretty left liberal, but there was plenty of people on the right side of the political aisle who also look around and see families struggling. And while they see for slightly different, interesting opportunity with family, talking about parenting and children and talking about the values, I think to transcend some of it's one of the few remaining places I think where you can sort of create, I almost term it like a horseshoe coalition, the left bending and the right bending backgrounds is actually close to each other. And you can start to see, like Mitt Romney out for like a child allowance or the expanded child tax credit along with people on the left. So I do think there's interesting, what you're identifying there, maybe a common enough diagnosis that we can actually do something about it. So that's also my moment of hope. So we're about 11 minutes left here. So Dr. Pugh, I want you to help us bring it home here. We start talking about, so we've been in the blue sky world, but that's not obviously the world that we always necessarily going to land in. And there's some other worlds we can land in. And if you've written like a decade in review of like parenting during the 2010s, well-being in the 2010s. And so the question I asked you is like, think about if you're now with us in 2031, you're looking back and you're writing decade in review for parents' well-being in the 2020s. Like what are the 2 or 3 kind of paths we're facing down here? And help us think about like, what are our choices?
Great question. Interesting assignment. I'm a little sad that I don't get to spin out the optimistic scenarios that my other panelists have been able to. So I'm bringing us down.
Reality checking. That's all.
Here's a couple of things that I see the seeds of right now. We could spin out in greater and greater inequality with, escape for the affluent and the poor stuck with the public. I think, was it Galbraith, the economist, who said squalor, private affluence and public squalor, I think was his term. I can imagine writing, and I don't want to write this, but I can imagine writing in 10 years, a decade in review, that calls this generation of children a throwaway generation. I can see that. I feel like this is a crisis. This is a moment of deep crisis for the children in our midst. When I talk to families and parents, it's related kind of to what I was talking about earlier with the intensification of parenting. The surveillance that children are under is truly frightening. Now, I say this, I'll give a little, first let me preface this with a little positive, which is children on many measures are doing better than they have for as long as we've been measuring. So for example, less likely to suffer abuse, less likely to be assaulted, less likely to commit crimes, less likely to have crimes committed against them, less likely to use drugs and alcohol, less likely to be pregnant, more likely to achieve high school graduation, better, all these outcome measures show that children are actually better off, and please forgive me, these are all pre-pandemic. Children are actually better off than they were 20, 30, 40 years ago, except in one. And remember, this is pre-pandemic, so it's only worse now, their mental health. So we are essentially, the way to explain that to ourselves, this paradox, is that we are essentially imprisoning children, trapping them in the gaze of adults. And so they're safer, but they are radically less, they have far less liberty or autonomy or capacity to figure out, to make their own mistakes, to figure out where things go wrong, and then to kind of figure out how to solve that, to develop their own resilience. So this all sounds like a very individual, like, oh, you parents, stop surveilling. But there are systems of surveillance that have taken over parenting from both from invited in by the child, you could say, through all that technology that they invite, but also through schools and through other kind of societal kind of entities that are all about watching children. And I feel like that is something we need to solve. And it's tied somehow to everything we've been describing. We've been describing intensification of parenting, but also insecurity and also inequality. We've been describing workism. Well, if you're a parent who's intensely focused on developing the best child you possibly can, and yet you have a 60, 70, 90-hour-a-week job, how are you going to do that? You're going to do that in part by the technological surveillance that is newly available to you and that is fully supported and provided by the schools in your midst. To speak also about how this is kind of stratified, this kind of surveillance is happening across class locations of children, but at the top, it's marketed and maybe it feels, I'm not sure, as a kind of cultivation. And at the bottom, it's about criminalization. And this is happening across class and across racial categories. And it's just changing what childhood feels like. And parents, yes, your hands are on the steering wheel. So for parents who are watching right now, I'd say, please dial back on the surveillance. But it is also a societal development. And to fight that, we need a care movement. We need to kind of talk about laws that rein in the technological outreach into schools. And we need to have a conversation about schooling that doesn't involve this kind of surveillance. Anyway, I could go on, but surveillance is a real problem. And it's a problem for children's liberty. They've become prisoners. And I see that is a 10-year trend that I might be writing about, and I don't want to.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating, and thank you. I think it's very illuminating too. I think the one other thing I'm gonna say, and then I think we have to just meet one question. Unfortunately, it's such a good discussion. I really wish we could go for another hour. The one other thing that I think we're seeing a trend is in, I mentioned at the beginning, like birth rates are at their all-time historic low in the United States. The gap between the number of children that are being born and the number of parents who are saying they want to have children is widening. And I do think that's something I also think we need to really be have our eye on, because that's going to be if we start having a society with not a lot of children, that has a lot of implications for everything from school funding. Go back to Zodana's point, because if there's less kids coming in, like that's how we're based. And then long term, our ability to fight things like climate change, our ability to have this sort of strong sort of population that's going to let us sort of think through and move on to the next generation. We have to have another generation to pass all this on to. So that's also something I'm keeping my eye on, as I think there are a couple of different paths for that in the next generation as well, the next 10 years as well. So on that, we remember one question. I think the one that's maybe the most broadly applicable, that's the ones I'm just glancing at quickly, is basically there are a bunch of listeners asking, what can they do about it? Like we've convinced them that there's something needs to happen. How can they get involved in advocating or in being part of the conversation? And so, Dana, I'd love to start with you on this one. And since I know you're actively involved in some parent advocacy work.
Yes, I love this question because it's actually, I think a lot of people think they have to do these big grand gestures like running for office. And that's part of the reason why I started the podcast, which is called Parenting and Politics, because I wanted parents to kind of make the connections between how our politics affects our parenting, especially like at a local level, but also because all parents have a voice, right? And I think a lot of times before you have children, you don't realize that all these things don't exist that you're going to need when you become a parent. And then I think you become a parent and you're like, oh my God, there's no paid leave. What do you mean there's no paid leave in the United States? And you start Googling and you start looking up organizations. And that's actually what happened to me. I was pregnant and I was like, there's no paid leave. And I started going on Twitter, and that's how I linked up with different organizations. And I just started sharing my story. So I think if I could just say one thing is really share your story. Share your story. A lot of times I think as parents, we kind of like don't want to. It's very personal, but I guarantee you someone else is going through exactly the same thing you're going through. Lawmakers need to hear your story. I actually was part of a roundtable in July with the Ways and Means Committee, and it was virtual, and I started crying because my childcare had closed because of COVID. They closed forever, and I was just completely heartbroken. And I was sharing the story with the chairman, and I started crying. And actually, just yesterday, they published that clip of me saying, that childcare is an issue that's across partisan lines, that we're all struggling, we're all suffering. And I think it's really important for lawmakers to really see that aside from data, it's one thing for you to talk about a data point saying, this percentage of families feel this or need this. It's another thing for you to call or write to your legislators and say, this is the real consequence of this, of me not having access to this, or this is what happens in my life when, I don't have access to affordable childcare or affordable healthcare, which is really huge. So I would think it's really important to share those stories, which means being a little vulnerable, crying in front of, lawmakers. But at the end of the day, it can be daunting to talk to lawmakers, but I think it's also important to know that they're public servants and they work for us. And, at the end of the day, they should be hearing from us. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there too. Like I said, I think we could keep talking for a very long time about this. And I'm hoping, in the course of the newsletter, also I can bring each of you, on, do some more interviews or just generally get your voices out there more, because you each represent a really important perspective. I'm going to let Joe to say goodbye, but I did want to also just thank one more time, and Helen, Diana, Dr. Pugh, Dr. Stockstill. I wanted to thank Capita for bringing this to life, to curating and hosting this newsletter. And if you don't follow Capita or aren't signed up for their newsletters, please make sure you do so. And Joe says he's good, and it's 4:00. So I believe very strongly in respecting people's time. So I'm going to leave it there. I look forward to being in dialogue with you all moving forward. Thank you to people who are participating. Thank you again to the panelists, Joe and Capita, and have a wonderful afternoon.